You know, for all the countless hours I wasted reviewing the Earth's Children books back in the day, the one aspect of the franchise that I never really addressed was the 1986 movie adaptation. Partly because I was burned out from talking about it for so long, and partly because it's not that easy to get hold of these days. And it's not like I'd illegally download it from a torrent site or anything. Ha ha ha. But for better or worse, the movie is still a significant part of the history of the Earth's Children series, and I think it's worth examining in closer detail, so let's get into this. By the mid-1980s, the Earth's Children series was in full swing, with 2 blockbuster successes under its belt and a 3rd book already underway. People were going nuts for the story of Ayla and her prehistoric adventures, which had tapped into a rising tide of feminism in the early 80s, so it wasn't long before Hollywood sensed there was money to be made from this. The plan was to adapt Clan of the Cave Bear into a movie, with the intention of launching a successful film franchise that would eventually see all of the Earth's Children novels get a cinematic release. Gene Owl, the author, was on board with the idea and signed over the film rights to the Producer Sales Organisation. A script was soon produced, and in the summer of 1984, production started on the Clan of the Cave Bear movie, with Daryl Hannah starring in the title role. I imagine you know the plot well enough by now. Clan of the Cave Bear tells the story of Ayla, a young Cro-Magnon girl living during the last ice age. When an earthquake kills her family and leaves her stranded alone in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving wilderness, she's taken in by a tribe of Neanderthals calling themselves the Clan, who eventually decide to raise her as one of their own. The Clan have a very strictly defined gender roles brought about by millions of years of evolution, and they've reached a point where they can no longer change or develop, but Ayla can. Whereas their lives are based around tradition and memory, hers is founded on innovation and creativity. As she grows up, she starts to rebel against their male-dominated culture, which brings her into conflict with Broud, the violent and jealous son of the tribe's leader. Matters finally reach a head when the former leader retires and Broud assumes command, banishing Ayla from the clan and forcing her to leave behind the son she's given birth to during her time with them. The movie ends with Ayla venturing out in search of her own people, leaving behind the only family she can remember and facing up to an uncertain future with newfound hope and strength. The film was released in North America in January 1986, gaining mostly negative reviews from film critics and poor word of mouth as a result. The legions of book fans failed to turn up in equal numbers for its film counterpart. It would go on to make less than $2 million during its theatrical run, nowhere near its $15 million budget. This commercial flop, combined with Owl's anger at the treatment of her source material, effectively ended any possibility of further movie adaptations. It wasn't until 2014, almost 3 decades later, that another attempt would be made. So there it is. Clan of the Cave Bear is left to stand alone, unloved and unwanted, a white elephant that few fans of the series even talk about, a monument to the hubris of Hollywood and the dangers of trying to jump on a moving bandwagon. But was it really that bad? Did it deserve the anger and disrespect it's gotten over the years? Well, the weird thing about this movie is that in theory it had a lot of solid people attached to it that should have prevented it from being a flop. The scriptwriter John Sayles has twice been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, first for Passion Fish and then for Lone Star. He also wrote Battle Beyond the Stars, which officially makes him a legend in my book because that movie was bloody awesome. Michael Chapman, the director, has worked with the likes of Martin Scorsese and Ivan Reitman over the years, racking up more than 40 feature film credits to his name, including Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Lost Boys and The Fugitive. Alan Silvestri, another industry veteran, handled the soundtrack, so there were no worries on that score. Jesus, they even had Jan de Bont as director of photography. On the acting front, Daryl Hannah was fresh off the successes of Blade Runner and Splash. With her star on the rise in Hollywood, she was ready to transition into leading roles, and a highly successful adaptation of a blockbuster novel could provide the springboard to A-list status that she was looking for. James Remar, another respected and established actor, was on hand to play Kreb, lending some much-needed gravitas to the role. The movie was made on a budget of $15 million, which is actually pretty respectable for a mid-1980s movie that didn't make use of special effects. For comparison, that equates to about $36 million in today's money. Not exactly Avengers level, but enough to put together a decent production all the same. All the right elements were in place to make Clan of the Cave Bear a smash hit, so what the hell happened? Well, let's start with the positives of this movie. For the most part, the movie follows the plot of the book pretty faithfully. All of the main events and plot threads are in place, even if it does skip over some portions of Ayla's early life for the sake of brevity. The cinematography is solid and there's some gorgeous landscape shots at times. The movie was filmed mostly in Canada, so there's plenty of snowy mountains and sprawling woodland. It really does look like an untouched wilderness in a time before humanity had conquered the world. The soundtrack is perfectly fine for an 80s movie, I guess, plenty of flutes and tribal drums like you'd expect, although it does manage to conjure up some fairly poignant tracks during the most significant moments of the film, particularly near the end when Ayla's leaving the clan behind. It really does manage to summon up a bit of emotion and make some effort to capture the feel of the novel's most iconic scenes. The actors also seem to be taking it pretty seriously, considering what they're forced to go through. Daryl Hannah gives it her best shot as Ayla, and she's not a bad fit for the character. She's suitably tall and blonde and statuesque, even if it's pretty obvious she's way older than her book counterpart. Hannah was 25 when this movie was being filmed, and she looks it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I can understand that the prospect of a 12-year-old girl being raped on screen isn't something any of us would want to see, but it does feel a bit weird when the movie skips more than a decade of her life in the space of a few seconds. Kreb and Isa are both decent in their roles, doing what they can with almost no dialogue to work with and some pretty atrocious makeup. Basically, in this movie, the Neanderthals just look like regular people with really bad hair and messed up teeth who haven't washed for a couple of weeks. It's a bit like your average night out in Scotland then. As I mentioned before, this movie was made in an age before everything was CGI'd to death, and while it's kind of refreshing to know that what you see on screen was done with practical effects, there are still times when it's let down by these technical limitations. One scene where a young child is snatched by a passing predator is supposed to be harrowing and tense, but it comes across as farcical when you can clearly see it's just a doll being shaken around. Another scene where a bear attacks and kills one of the clan hunters is equally silly, since it's basically a trained circus animal awkwardly hugging a stuntman. Movies like The Revenant were able to make encounters like this feel visceral and terrifying through a combination of CGI and practical effects, but sadly Clan of the Cave Bear never comes close to this. But these are just minor gripes. The real issue I think with this movie is in the storytelling. Ayla's growing rebellion against clan tradition and her conflict with Browd, which is probably the central theme of the book, feels rushed and simplified here. Their rivalry was about more than just two people who couldn't get along with each other. It was a clash of cultures and ideologies, with Ayla representing progress and innovation, and Browd representing tradition and stagnation. It was the classic story of the old order versus the new world, the rebel against the establishment. The parallels with the growing women's rights movement in the 1980s were clearly woven into the story, but they never became overwhelming. Ultimately, Ayla's only real victory over Browd was survival, and that was enough. But here it just boils down to Browd being a jealous asshole who beats and rapes Ayla until she stops giving a shit, so he can't rise to the occasion anymore if you catch my drift. The movie is much more heavy-handed when it comes to their final confrontation as well, with Browd literally fighting it out with Ayla like this is some kind of WWE event. Of course, she beats him down and humiliates him in front of the whole clan, proving how awesome she is before leaving on her own terms, head held high in victory, accompanied by an obnoxiously bad narration literally telling us what we've just seen. So what the hell am I trying to say with all this? Well, I guess my point is that the failure of this movie isn't necessarily down to its own fault. The Earth's Children books relied heavily on explanation and deep personal introspection to drive forward their narratives, especially Clan of the Cave Bear. When you actually consider what happens in them from an events point of view, they're actually pretty simplistic stories that get you from A to B without too many twists or diversions. Their appeal is in their narrative richness, the believability and complexity of their worlds, and the personal discoveries of their characters. But film doesn't work like that. It's primarily a visual medium that relies on showing rather than telling, and these deep elements are difficult to properly represent on screen, especially for casual movie viewers. This movie even has to resort to narration at times to help make sense of things. In a way, it's a shame this movie didn't do well enough to justify a sequel, because it would have been interesting to see how they might have handled books like Valley of Horses and The Mammoth Hunters, which are much more straightforward from a narrative point of view. I won't say that the Clan of the Cave Bear is unfilmable, but it would take a very deft hand to bring something like this properly to life and do it justice, and Hollywood in the 1980s just couldn't deliver on that promise. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there was one further attempt to bring this series to life in the 21st century, and I'll probably do a separate video on that if people are interested. That being said, I can't say I'm terribly enthusiastic about seeing a modern day interpretation of Ayla's story, which would almost certainly be surrounded by a storm of 2018 identity politics and social media warfare, and that sort of thing just makes me want to kill myself. In conclusion then, The Clan of the Cave Bear is kind of a mixed bag. It's not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination, and it certainly suffers from the technical limitations of its time, but I do see it as a genuine stab at a very challenging book adaptation. There's a certain charm to it despite, or perhaps because of these shortcomings, and I don't think it deserves all of the hate it's gotten over the years. It's still possible to find it in 2018, so do yourself a favour and have a go at Ayla's one and only cinematic outing. But bring a couple of beers along for the ride. Thanks for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative. If so, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons to see more videos like this. Did you enjoy the movie? Would you like to see a modern remake of it? Do you want to know more about the TV show that they tried to release a few years ago? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section and have yourselves a great day. See you all next time.